All right, here we are. Hello, everyone. My name is Colton Gilbert. I am one of the debate coaches at Little Rock Central, and I was asked to work with, Next Step Debate Institute. And I must say, I love the idea. I think you all have a great lineup of people to listen to, and I am just here to hopefully give you some thoughts that will make debating a little easier for you. I think one thing that I have up my sleeve is that I am planning to talk to you a lot from a judge's perspective, so you all sort of can get an idea of, not just how to make arguments, but also how judges evaluate them, and specifically what judges look for. In case anyone's wondering, I'm wearing my RBG shirt today. All right, so today we're going over impact calculus. So it is exactly what it sounds like. So we'll just move along. All right, so probably one of the more frustrating things when I'm judging is that I think too often debaters sort of take this portion of the debate for granted, right? You just get up there and you say, oh, we got a big impact, it happens fast, and it's likely to happen, and it's like, all right, cool, like what does that even mean? Like, so as a judge, oftentimes, you're sort of left to wonder exactly how to sift through this. And there's so much more to this, or so much more nuance than just those buzzwords that we hear you all toss out all the time. And so a couple of things to sort of help with these debates is two things from a judge's perspective that I think will help you all. Number one, prioritize arguments, right? In this debate, should I center my ballot or prioritize large scale magnitude type impacts, or should I more prioritize more probable impacts that probably aren't things like nuclear war or stuff like that, right? Or great power war, things like that. Economic decline would also fall in that category. So evaluating impacts that are more probable would exclude all of those that I just mentioned. And another thing is, I think you all should sort of write our ballots, right? And I want to sort of every once in a while I'll reference, those KF rounds where you may read framework or TUSFG, right? You're still evaluating impacts, right? The impact of like clash or fairness or structural versus procedural fairness, all those kinds of things. You should be writing the judges' ballots for us. And I think this is a good place to sort of take the ink and just sort of let it flow metaphorically. So one of the ways we sort of look at things in debate, right? Utilitarian calculi, right? Do we think util is good or do we not think it's good, right? Should we make decisions based on how they maximize life for, or, as many lives as possible? What is the best life for as many people as possible, right? Sure, that on face may seem like a very good metric to evaluate impacts, right? If I may do something that could trigger, if I'm in a policy position that may trigger nuclear war, right? Should I always prioritize that risk of nuclear war over other things? Or in the face of that, does that mean that, like, if I only look at things like nuclear war, am I making a sort of all lives matter argument, right? Am I saying that even if I concede, right, if I say I should always avert existentially or avoid these existential impacts, that means that I have to inherently concede that there may be some things going on in the status quo that might be bad, but that's not as important as saving as many people as possible. But like, what does that say about the suffering that we see going on daily, right? So when you look at utilitarianism, we sort of look at things like body counts, right? Is the death of a lot of people ethical to save a few, right? Under utilitarian calculus, some would say no, right? We also want to talk about like future generations, right? We want to preserve the world for future generations. We want to make it so that, right, we can sort of have bloodlines go on, futurity good, all that kind of stuff, right? But if we look at, things like utilitarianism bad, I've sort of already went over, the whole like all lives matter concept, right? So if you're a team that sort of reads, if you want to read a more structural violence centered impact, right, then this is probably these types of arguments on the right-hand column is where you want to sort of get your mojo, right? You want to sort of say that, like, in a world where we always look at or prioritize existential risks, we'll always sort of put to the back burner or footnote the types of suffering that we see daily, right? We can talk about averting climate change and things like that, but that means nothing to Black people who live near oil refineries and have poor air quality and suffer from asthma all the time. That essentially nullifies that type of suffering or those types of impacts, right? The Physical ones, like I sort of went on, talked about, right? In the asthma scenario, these sort of ongoing impacts, but also psychological impacts too, right? In a world where you live in a constant state of like trauma, or you're worried about certain types of things, that is probably not a good life to live. So even if you are, right? So then that just begs a question, like, is being alive good enough, right? Like, even if you are alive, is that a life that is worth living, right? These are the sort of questions utilitarianism sort of falls short in answering, right? So, other side of the coin, right? Deontological calculi, right? Is deontology good, right? Should we maximize quality of life, right? We should continue life, right? Even if extinction might be important, the ways in which we live our life, right, is also important, right? That quality of life. The belief that certain lives are not as valuable justifies state-sanctioned violence, right? So in a world where, in a world where we're reading an app that talks about the way in which the government treats Native and indigenous populations, right? And we say that when you prioritize existential impacts, you always will justify that state-sanctioned violence, because it's like, oh, well, the U.S. has kind of been terrible towards Native and indigenous folk, and we got y'all in the future, but like nuclear warfare to happen. Don't you want to live so you can get all the stuff that you claim is happening, right? That's sort of where deontology sort of is like, we should not evaluate those types of impacts, right? So everything on the left-hand side is sort of extends on the critique of utilitarianism being bad, right? Deontology good, right? The nature of morality and like what is good life is up for debate, right? Like, what is a valuable life? How should we sort of perceive these? Right? That's up for debate. We don't necessarily get that in the world of utilitarianism, because utilitarianism just says, as long as you live in, that's good enough. If you can breathe, good enough, right? But why would this metric of prioritizing structural violence and that kind of stuff might be bad, right? The impotence in the face of disaster, right? Even if our intentions are pure, and even if we should pass the act because it would actually end like violence against Native populations, is that impotence in the face of disaster if we win an argument that passing that policy to alleviate the trauma caused to Native and indigenous peoples would lead to something that causes an existential threat? Is it worth it, right? Is something that excuse me, could be used to sort of short circuit these types of arguments, right? One would argue that like the metric of looking at things or evaluating arguments in sort of a deontological perspective means that that's not very pragmatic, right? Because sometimes hard decisions or tough choices really do have to be made both in the short term, in the long term, and deontology or deontological evaluations of things sort of don't answer those questions. So that's sort of like a framing, right? Util, existential threats, right? Nuke war, we want to avert all those. Deontology would say we should sort of focus on impacts that are happening ongoing right now, et cetera, in a very like easy to process and understand version. That's not quite what these mean, but for the purposes of how we evaluate things in debate, I think this is a very good starting point. So from here, we'll move on to all the buzzwords, right? First one is magnitude. Sure, this can be about the biggest impact, right? But what exactly defines the biggest impact, right? One could say that the biggest impact is, say, averting nuclear war, right? That if we pass this policy, it'll lead to great power war. We start launching nukes, mutual assured destruction doesn't apply, and the world goes bang and we go with it, right? Or it could be like economic downturn, diversionary theory. We don't have a boogeyman internally, so we project that externally, which leads to a type of war, right? Sure, those are big impacts, but like, is the hypothetical threat of a nuclear war that probably won't happen a large impact when people have to deal with psychological and physical trauma every single day, right? So I think this is a place where those soft left abs can sort of flip, right, the evaluation for the judge, right? What is nuclear war when Black people face extinction or an attempt to make us go extinct every single day? I don't know. I never have to worry about, well, what if Biden does something and that triggers Russia to be mad and China hops on and Iran is like, here's our chance. And then everybody just starts launching nukes. I don't worry about that as a Black person. I worry about every time I hear police sirens, are they coming for me? You know, I worry about walking into a store and being followed. I worry about how I'm being perceived as an angry Black person. All that type of psychological trauma that I deal with day in and day out, to me, feels like a bigger impact that affects me than, say, nuclear war. Doesn't necessarily mean when I'm evaluating these as a judge, I'll always default to that. But I think the ability to sort of localize these impacts for the judge and sort of paint or flip that paradigm in terms of magnitude, if you're these sort of soft left apps, is important. You know, and I do think that this is a portion of the impact debate that people sort of take for granted, right? You know, we just say, well, we got a big impact, bro. Like, you got to vote for it. Like, who don't want to stop nuclear war? Like, sure, but like, why should that, like, why is nuclear war the biggest impact that, or why is climate change the biggest impacts, right? That I could save off hypothetically with my ballot, right? So moving on, probability. How likely is your impact to happen, right? Nuclear war probably is not that likely, right? Economic downturn, right? I mean, I've lived through a few recessions in my life on my 33 years at the time of the recording of this video on this earth, right? And I've seen economic or some form semblance of like markets crashing and us rebounding. So why exactly does an economic downturn trigger great power war, right? How probable, how likely is that, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be a numbers game, but the numbers game can sort of help when conceptualizing these large scale impacts, right? But if we want to take the numbers route, then if you're reading these structural violence sort of soft left type impacts, then you should always be ahead on the probability debate, because chances are your impacts are happening in the status quo, right? On the CJR topic at Central, our novices read a 1033 Ave, right? They said police are overly militarized now. That leads to actual physical violence, things like no-knock raids, right? Which unfortunately we know was a thing that sort of led to Breonna Taylor being murdered by the police. And we sort of, militarization of psychological trauma. These were things that we knew were super probable to happen. Why? Because they were happening in the status quo. There's 100% likelihood because they're happening, right? On the water topic, if you're reading an argument that says water pollution is literally killing people daily, lead in water pipes, indigenous folks don't have access to clean water, right? You are winning a probably 100% risk that if you don't vote AF, these impacts will continue to happen and probably get worse. Whereas, right? So chances are, because of that, you should do and sit here more, right? And we'll sort of get to like what it looks like when you sort of combine all these at the end. Multiple internal links should sort of lessen the likelihood of an impact scenario. So this is more so applicable to hard right AFs or disads that sort of rely on that notion of thinking, right? If there is a 10% chance that the AF triggers a link, and then a 10% chance that the internal link is triggered that leads to the impact, that is only a 1% risk that we get to their impact. So why should I prioritize a 1% risk of an impact when when instead I could be like, there is suffering going on right now that my ballot can alleviate, right? And that's sort of where we get into like why UTIL might be good or not good, depending on what side of the debate you are sitting on here, right? But this is important, is that too often these things aren't prioritized in the debate. You'll say magnitude, probability, and sure, that's cool, but like, which one is more important, right? If I'm reading sort of a soft left structural violence type app, I'll probably want to prioritize probability, right? And I want to minimize magnitude, right? So maybe I read some cards, some preempts that sort of paint this picture for me, that sort of focusing on existential impacts sort of papers over the suffering of certain populations, et cetera, right? So whether you're making this analysis, in the debate, or you're looking at what type of framing cards you want to put in the 1AC. Those are the types of things that you should think about in the F construction. Time frame. How quickly will your impacts happen, right? And to be honest, this is probably one of the more poorly explained portions of, impact calculus or whatever, right? Is there's sure, like, time frame, how likely is something I'm sorry, just full disclosure, I'm in an Airbnb in DC, and it's kind of like the basement, and the folks that I guess live, whatever, they're coming through and I can see them out the window. So if you want to know why I kept looking off, I'm sorry. But right, so these are poorly explained because they say, well, what just happens faster? I ain't saying you got to tell me it's going to be a 6-month time period, right? But sort of that does sometimes help conceptualize these things, right? If you say great power war is likely to happen, but that's like a few years off. If the app, if the neg is reading an argument, a disad that leads to power war, and the app is like, well, that won't happen for some years because geopolitically things don't move at the drop of a hat like that, then maybe that means the time frame isn't as important when evaluating existential impacts, or it is more important when you're looking at things like structural violence, because those things are happening now, right? It will happen again and again. It'll happen tomorrow. It'll happen next week. It'll happen next month. Until you vote AF, it'll keep happening in these hypothetical worlds where I have a ballot and I have to decide who's winning or who's going to lose this debate, right? And the utility of time frame is often forgotten, pun intended, right? A likely impact that takes forever to manifest might be less appealing than a quick impact that has a lower probability, right? But as a judge, you should be doing that work for me, right? You shouldn't just be like, oh, we got a quick one. We have a quick impact. It's big and it's probable. Sure, the other team is probably saying that too. So what are you doing to differentiate yourself from what your opponents are saying? And that's sort of where we're getting to now. I think, yeah, okay, that's where we're getting to now. All right, so some tricks of the trade before we sort of go on, right? Root cause claims. You'll oftentimes see these on in critique debates, right? If we can win, if the AF is saying, OMG, water is terminally terrible, it's polluted, blah, 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 we should pass this water quality AF, and boom, the EPA will regulate water, and we all have clean drinking water, blah, 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 right? And the next, well, cool, but regulations don't solve, and cap is killing us all, blah, 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 blah. If you win a risk that capitalism is the root cause of water pollution, then you simplified the impact debate, right? Because it doesn't matter how likely their impacts are, doesn't matter how big they are. If you're winning that they misdiagnosed the problem, i.e. they don't address the root cause, then you have fundamentally short-circuited their best offense, right? But the problem here is that people just be like, cap is the root cause. Everybody like money. Nah, fam, it's way more nuanced than that, right? Why is capitalism the root cause of pollution, right? Because companies have an incentive to not take care of the environment. Why? Because measures that are environmentally friendly tend to cost money, tend to cost more people power, and in turn eats into profits. Corporations don't work for the little people like us. So because of that, they don't care about dumping, pollution into water streams, right? They don't care about lead pipes. They don't care about, unfortunately, building pipelines that'll run through indigenous water and through indigenous aquifers, right? They don't care about that because they only care about the bottom line, right? So you have to be able to articulate why exactly is that the root cause of violence, right? Right? If you're reading set call, right, and you say in the app, it's oh, well, the U.S. government has never protected indigenous water. We should pass this act, and blah, blah, blah. And the neg is all right, cool, but that is part and parcel of a larger project, which is settler colonial dominance, which seeks to, exterminate, move, forced assimilation, et cetera, native individuals, right? So while the AF may say, oh my goodness, natives don't have access to clean water, that is only a byproduct of settler colonial violence, because settlers have always subjugated natives and used their suffering as the foundation of settler society. That type of analysis is what judges are looking for when it comes to these root cause type claims, right? Turns case analysis, right? Oh, this turns the case. So like, did you just like hit him with a reverse card from Uno? Like, I don't know what that means, right? Do that analysis. What does it turns case means? Why does great power war turn all of their environment impacts? If the app is like, we should improve water quality, and that is more important than the risk of great power war, the next should be getting up and saying that if we win a risk that great power war happens, we think that war will terminally make water quality globally terrible, which probably exacerbates their impacts because they're only reading impacts that are US specific. We'll win a risk that A, water quality in the US will be terminally worse in a world of great power war. And B, if we win a risk of like nuclear war globally, that means that water sources are probably going to be tainted all over the globe, which only intensifies the need for war, because now it's not only just a war for like great power war, like a hegemonic war, but you have now inserted the idea of resource wars, that there will now only be a limited supply of drinkable water. Then you can get into mutually assured destruction doesn't apply, Like there are a lot of arguments you can sort of get to, right? But too often, you know, debaters are like, well, the disad turns the case or the link turns the case. And it's like, I mean, sure, but like how, right? Like how, right? Like if I'm reading a politics disad and I'm winning a risk that the app is politically divisive, why does that turn the app, right? Like to just say that like the link turns the app sometimes, a lot of times doesn't make sense. But if you're making an argument that because it's so politically divisive, the version that the app passes will inevitably be rolled back by another administration or through enforcement or through conservative states challenging at the state court level in federal courts. Like there are a lot of arguments you can make, right? But just saying that it turns it isn't good enough, right? Don't take us judges for granted, right? Yes, I think writing blocks are good, but I always prefer in-round specific analysis over just some generic blocks that you wrote or respectfully that your coach wrote, right? Because I think that sometimes when we're block writing, we're trying to like think about all the possibilities and make it generic to where it fits everything, but then it ends up being so generic that it fits nothing, right? So excuse the kids upstairs. They've been practicing for the Olympics. Whatever 2032 is, these kids upstairs gonna happen. But that's specific analysis over just like generic blocks. Always helps. So one of the last things I want to sort of go over is a 2NR, 2AR split. No matter the debate, there should be impact calculus in the last two rebuttals. Everything that I've said has been sort of centered around existential impact, structural violence impact. So I do want to sort of come back to planless apps and when people read sort of like TUSFG, et cetera, right? If I'm going for clash and second, third, fourth level testing, right? The ability to explain what that looks like, what that means, and why that impact outweighs whatever the AF is going for. Conversely, if I'm the AF and I'm like, clash, it doesn't matter in a world where we are winning, that like the only clash that actually happens is anti-blackness in the face of black flesh, right? And that's if you're right. So those sort of like critiques of like structural criticisms, right? Why is procedural fairness more important than structural fairness, right? These types of arguments are also impacts, but not in the sense that we understand utilitarianism versus deontological understandings. It's not quite the focus of where we are, but I do think it's important to sort of highlight that oftentimes neg teams, I think, sometimes lose in these debates more often than they should, because their ability to explain what their impact is and why that matters or outweighs what the AF's impacts are is sometimes lacking, mainly because negatives don't answer case. Got to answer, if you're going for framework or TUSFG, win some defensive, presumptuous, or risk of that argument on case, which then sort of short circuits all of their offense or impact turns that they're going to go for on framework. That is another conversation for another day. But comparative analysis is critical when we're just looking at impacts in general, right? Winning your arguments, being like, oh my God, like we're ahead on magnitude and probability, you can spin that enough times and get yourself through prelims and have a decent record probably, maybe, right? But comparative analysis will win you out rounds. So what do I mean by that, right? If I'm winning that probability and structural violence is more important, and the other team might be ahead on magnitude being important or like saving lives, et cetera, sure, we think probability is important, but even if the neg is ahead on magnitude, that doesn't matter, because their magnitude impacts will always sort of, footnote structural ongoing systemic violence, whether that be physical trauma, whether that is psychological trauma, whether that is lack of access to clean water, whether that is, whatever the case may be, right? So being aware in round is critical, right? The best debaters, I think, are really good at playing the even if game. Even if they're ahead on this question, that does not matter because blah, right? So look, think about it this way. Even if they're ahead, this is what a good, okay, I'm reading a soft left act. I stand up in the 2AR, and I say, look, we're ahead of them on probability, right? They might be ahead of us on magnitude, but that doesn't matter because extend the Mitchell 17 evidence that says when you prioritize existential threats, you sort of footnote or paper over ongoing structural violence. Also, we will win a risk that our impacts will happen quicker than the other team's impact. So even if they're ahead on magnitude, that does not matter in a world where our impacts are more probable and in a world where our impacts will happen faster. That is a super compelling 2AR. And if I hear something like that, that is literally probably what my ballot will start with, right? The 2AR sort of tells me, even if the neg is ahead, that nuclear war will happen, it don't happen fast enough, and it's probably not likely, which is why I should prioritize systemic impacts, right? That is what we mean when we say you should sort of be writing our ballots in these debates. So it's not enough to just say, hit me with a buzzword about, the disad turns the case, or da-da-da-da-da, or we're winning a root cause claim. Okay, sure, but like, why does that matter? You have to be able to explain to me, why does that matter, right? So the impact calculus debates, I sort of have always taught, like even in the classroom and my debate classes for kids who don't compete, when we go over these sort of things, I always tell them like the impact debate should always answer the why should I care question, right? And that sort of, for me, is what helped me understand when I was sort of explaining, like, hey, mom, like, hey, we've been sort of researching this argument. She'd be like, Colton, I don't care. Like, why should I care about that? And one time she hit me with that, and I was like, okay, I respect that. I respect that. Why should you care, right? Just because I told you nuclear war might happen, like, why should I care? Is it likely to happen? Well, then I don't care, right? Will it kill us all? It'll just kill a few people and we can start over. It'll be a limited nuclear war. That ain't that bad, right? Those are the types of things, right, that debaters are able to understand, and the good ones do, right? So be sure you are answering the why should I care question. How do we get there? By telling me how big it is, the thing that you should care about, how likely it is, and how fast it happens. Conversely, you want to always keep your tricks in the bag, right? You turn, the disad turns the case, or the risk of the link on cap will always be sort of like a case turn, or if you want to, sort of make a root cause claim, anything here, you have to be able to use this sort of impact calculi. I hope this was not confusing. If you have any questions, you can email me, and I really appreciate you, sitting here. Hopefully this was informative, and good luck to you all this year and the rest of your debate careers.